In the spring of 1565, Malta should have fallen. The Ottoman fleet had come across the Mediterranean like a moving wall of timber, canvas, iron, and men. Behind it stood one of the most powerful empires on earth. Ahead of it lay a dry, exposed island held by a displaced order of knights, men who had already lost the Holy Land, lost Rhodes, and seemed, to many observers, to be living on borrowed time. Malta was not supposed to withstand an empire, and yet it did. To understand why, we have to slow the scene down. Not begin with victory, not begin with legend. Begin instead with the smell of salt and smoke, with limestone walls under bombardment, with men watching the horizon, and knowing that the shape of history itself might be sailing toward them. Malta was more than an island. It was the last hard stone in a dangerous channel between worlds. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe, so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. And as we begin, leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are watching from tonight. It's a reminder of how far these forgotten echoes can reach. Because the question at the heart of this story is not simply how a siege was survived. It is how an order without a homeland, stripped of its old crusading world, cornered on a poor and wind-battered island, managed to resist an empire that had broken stronger powers before. The Knights Hospitaller had been exiles before. They had been defeated before. But Malta would test something deeper than courage. It would test whether an institution built for a vanished age could adapt quickly enough to survive the modern violence of artillery, empire, and sea power. This is the story of the island that should have fallen, and the order that refused to disappear. The Knights Hospitaller did not begin as the kind of men who made empires nervous. Their earliest reputation was not built on siege towers or naval raids, but on care. In the world of the Crusades, where pilgrimage could be dangerous, expensive, and physically brutal, the Hospitallers were associated with the sick, the poor, and the exhausted travelers who arrived in the Holy Land after long journeys by sea and road. Their name carried the memory of a hospital before it carried the weight of a fortress. That detail matters, because later, when we see them armored, disciplined, and firing cannon from the walls of Malta, it is easy to imagine that they had always been a military machine. They had not. Like many institutions that survive for centuries, they became what danger required them to become. The medieval world gave birth to several strange hybrids: monks who fought, warriors who took vows, religious orders that held land, commanded ships, negotiated with kings, and answered, at least in theory, to a higher spiritual purpose. To modern ears, it can sound contradictory, almost impossible. But in the Crusader states, the contradiction had a practical logic. Pilgrims needed protection. Christian territories needed defending. Wealth needed administering. Roads, ports, castles, and hospitals all needed men who could obey orders and endure hardship. The Hospitallers learned to inhabit that contradiction. They were not alone. The most famous of these military religious orders, the Knights Templar, became a symbol of crusading power and eventually of political danger. The Templars accumulated influence, land, money, and a reputation that made them useful until it made them vulnerable. In the early 14th century, under immense pressure from the French crown, the order was destroyed. Its leaders were arrested. Its reputation blackened by accusations that remained debated and tangled in politics, and its memory was handed over to rumor. The Hospitallers watched that catastrophe from dangerously close range. And this is where their survival becomes more interesting than simple luck. They did not survive because they were harmless. They survived because they could still be made useful. After the fall of the Templars, much of the political world understood that a wealthy transnational military order could become a problem. Kings did not enjoy institutions that answered to someone else, owned property across borders, and maintained their own armed identity. The Hospitallers had to move carefully. They had to present themselves not as a rival power hiding behind religion, but as a necessary instrument in a wider Christian struggle. That required discipline, but also theater. An order survives not only by what it does, but by how it explains itself. The Hospitallers could point to their charitable origins, their hospital tradition, their vows, and their continuing role against Muslim powers in the Eastern Mediterranean. They were warriors, yes, but warriors with a purpose that could still be recognized by popes and princes. They were administrators, sailors, castle builders, and diplomats. Their identity was flexible enough to bend without appearing to break. The Templars became, fairly or unfairly, a warning about what happened when power lost political protection. The Hospitallers became a lesson in adaptation. This does not mean they were innocent figures drifting nobly through history. No serious account of the order can reduce them to saints in armor. They fought, they held wealth, they took part in the violent frontier world of crusade and counter-crusade. Their later naval activity would include raiding, captivity, and the grim commerce of ransom. The point is not that they were purer than the Templars. The point is that they proved harder to isolate, harder to condemn, and harder to make obsolete. They understood, perhaps earlier than many of their enemies, that survival is a political skill. When old crusading dreams began to fracture, the Hospitallers did not cling only to memory. They reorganized around function. If the Holy Land could no longer be held, then another base had to be found. If armies could not march securely across lost territories, then ships could carry the fight. If a hospital alone could not protect them, then walls and fleets could. Every transformation carried a cost. Every adjustment moved them further from their beginnings. But extinction is also a kind of purity, and the Hospitallers chose the less elegant road. They became difficult to remove. This is the hidden thread leading toward Malta. By 1565, the men waiting on that island were not simply medieval leftovers, stranded in an age of gunpowder. They were the product of centuries of institutional pressure. They had learned from collapse. They had learned from exile. They had learned from watching another great order fall under the weight of politics and suspicion. The Templars passed into legend, partly because their end was so dramatic that imagination rushed in to fill the spaces. The Hospitallers endured, which is less romantic but far more revealing. Survival left records, compromises, arguments, and scars. It forced them to keep making choices, and one of those choices would carry them out of the ruins of the Crusader East, away from the world that had made them, and onto the sea, where a new kind of war was waiting. When the Crusader states collapsed, the Hospitallers lost more than territory. They lost the world that had explained them. For generations, their purpose had been tied to a geography that could be pointed to on a map. Jerusalem, Acre, the roads of pilgrimage, the fragile chain of Christian-held cities and castles along the Eastern Mediterranean. Their vows, their violence, their hospitals, their wealth, all of it made sense within that landscape. Even when the politics were messy, the mission had a center. Then the center was gone. The fall of Acre in 1291 did not simply close a military chapter. It forced every surviving crusading institution to answer an uncomfortable question. What is a crusader order without a crusader state? Some groups faded into memory. Some were absorbed, dissolved, or redirected into local politics. The Hospitallers, however, did something more difficult. They accepted that the old war could no longer be fought in the old way. This was not a graceful transformation. Institutions rarely reinvent themselves because someone has a clean strategic vision and a quiet afternoon to think it through. They change because the ground disappears beneath them. The Hospitallers had to move from a land-based frontier, where castles guarded roads and territories, into a maritime frontier, where survival depended on harbors, ships, weather, intelligence, and the ability to strike or vanish before stronger forces arrived. The sea became their new border. At first glance, that may sound like a retreat. In one sense, it was. The Holy Land had been lost. The great dream of permanent Christian rule in Jerusalem had broken under the pressure of stronger regional powers and internal weakness. No amount of heroic language could disguise that. But retreat can also produce a sharper kind of adaptation. The Hospitallers no longer had to defend long, vulnerable inland lines. They could concentrate themselves on fortified islands, places hard to attack quickly and useful as naval bases. An island is a strange kind of refuge. It protects, but it also confines. It gives defenders a moat made by nature. Yet every sack of grain, every barrel of water, every reinforcement, every message from allies depends on the sea remaining open. A bad wind can matter as much as a bad commander. A distant king's hesitation can become hunger inside the walls. The Hospitallers learned this geography of dependence. They also learned diplomacy, not as decoration, but as oxygen. A military order without a kingdom behind it had to survive among kingdoms. It needed papal support, royal favor, commercial arrangements, safe harbors, money, recruits, and permission to exist in places controlled by other rulers. Too much independence could make it threatening. Too little independence could make it irrelevant. The order had to be useful without seeming uncontrollable, pious without becoming politically naive, militant without inviting the same suspicion that had helped destroy the Templars. This is one of the most easily missed parts of their story. We tend to remember the Hospitallers in moments of battle, when the choices are stark and the images are dramatic. Walls, cannon, banners, smoke. But their survival was also built in quieter rooms, in negotiations, legal privileges, financial arrangements, letters, alliances, and the patient maintenance of reputation. A sword can win a gate. It cannot by itself keep an institution alive for centuries. Their move into island power eventually brought them to Rhodes, a place that seemed to offer what exile required. A defensible base, a harbor, and a position from which they could watch and harass the sea lanes of the eastern Mediterranean. From there, the Hospitallers became not merely survivors of the Crusades, but naval actors in their own right. Their ships could raid Muslim commerce, intercept vessels, take captives, and insert the order into the violent economy of the Mediterranean. This was not a clean world divided neatly between noble defense and wicked aggression. The sea between Christian and Muslim powers was crowded with merchants, corsairs, pilgrims, slaves, diplomats, renegades, and opportunists who did not always fit the official stories told about them. The Hospitallers were part of that world. They defended, but they also attacked. They guarded Christian interests, but they also profited from maritime violence. Their identity as a religious order did not lift them above the harsher habits of the age. In fact, it helped them justify those habits. And yet, judging them only by modern discomfort can also flatten the story. The 15th and 16th century Mediterranean was not a peaceful commercial lake interrupted by fanaticism. It was a contested arena where empire, faith, money, and survival constantly overlapped. To be weak at sea was to invite attack. To hold an island without ships was to sit inside a stone trap. The Hospitallers understood that their future depended on becoming more than refugees with a glorious past. They had to become mobile. Mobility, in their case, did not mean rootlessness. It meant the ability to rebuild a center after losing one. First, the Holy Land. Then, later, Rhodes. Each catastrophe removed a layer of certainty. Each forced the order to carry its identity somewhere else, like a flame guarded against wind. That image can sound romantic, but the reality was more severe. Rebuilding meant money. It meant persuading noble families to keep sending sons. It meant maintaining discipline among men who were both monks and fighters, aristocrats and subordinates. It meant repairing ships, stocking fortresses, training gunners, and making sure that the order's old language of sacred duty still made sense in a world increasingly shaped by dynastic politics and artillery. What kept them alive was not nostalgia. Nostalgia can comfort an exile, but it cannot command a fleet. The Hospitallers survived because they became practical without fully surrendering the story they told about themselves. They could claim continuity with the Crusades while adapting to a new military environment. They could present themselves as guardians of Christendom while operating in the rough, transactional world of sea war. They could mourn what had been lost, but they did not build their future only as a monument to the past. This is why their exile matters. By the time Malta entered their story, the order had already endured the terrible education of displacement. They knew that walls could fall. They knew that allies could arrive late or not at all. They knew that an island could be salvation one year and a coffin the next. Their history had trained them to think in layers: defense, retreat, reputation, supply, command, morale. The men who would face the Ottoman Empire in 1565 were not simply defending a place. They were defending the possibility that an institution could lose almost everything and still remain itself. Rhodes was the kind of island that could make exile look like strategy. For the Hospitallers, it offered what the lost mainland could no longer give them: a defensible seat, a harbor, and a position of consequence. From Rhodes, they could watch the sea roads of the eastern Mediterranean. They could send ships into contested waters. They could remain visible to Christian Europe and irritating to Muslim powers. That irritation was not incidental. It was part of the island's value. A fortress that bothers no one may be safe for a while. A fortress that matters eventually receives visitors with cannon. By the early 16th century, the Ottoman Empire was no longer a distant pressure on the horizon. It was a vast imperial system with armies, fleets, engineers, administrators, and an expanding appetite for strategic control. Under Suleiman the Magnificent, Ottoman power was not simply large. It was organized, ambitious, and capable of applying pressure across several frontiers at once. Rhodes, sitting in the sea like a thorn in an imperial hand, could not be ignored forever. The siege of 1522 was not the first time Rhodes had faced danger. The island had already become used to living under threat. But there are moments when a familiar danger changes character. Raids, alarms, and earlier attacks belonged to one scale of violence. Suleiman's campaign belonged to another. The order confronted an empire that could bring not only soldiers, but time. That is one of the colder truths of siege warfare. A fortress does not fall only because attackers are brave or defenders are weak. It falls because pressure is sustained long enough for the balance inside the walls to change. Stone breaks. Ammunition shrinks. Food becomes calculation. Wounds become infections. Sleep becomes a luxury. Hope becomes something commanders have to ration carefully, because too much false confidence can be as dangerous as despair. On Rhodes, the Hospitallers resisted with the discipline expected of them. They had walls, experience, and a tradition of fighting from fortified positions. They also had a reputation to defend. This mattered more than pride. The order's legitimacy rested on being seen as a living military religious force, not a relic protected by old privileges. If Rhodes collapsed too easily, the political question would return with sharp teeth. What purpose did the Hospitallers still serve? But courage could not solve the arithmetic forever. The Ottomans pressed the island with siege works, artillery, and manpower. The defenders endured, repaired, countered, and held as long as they could. Later accounts naturally shaped the story into a drama of heroic resistance, and much of that tone is understandable. Sieges invite legend because they compress human experience into unbearable spaces. Yet the more useful lesson is not simply that the knights were brave. Many doomed defenders have been brave. The lesson is that even a highly disciplined order could be overwhelmed when geography, imperial resources, and isolation aligned against it. Rhodes fell, or more precisely, Rhodes reached the point where continued resistance could no longer preserve the island and might only destroy the order with it. The surrender allowed the Hospitallers to depart. That detail is important. Their enemies did not exterminate them. Suleiman's victory took the island, but it did not erase the institution. The order left Rhodes defeated, humiliated, and homeless, but still intact enough to become a problem somewhere else. This is where the story turns. For a lesser institution, the loss of Rhodes might have become the final page. After all, the Hospitallers had already lost the Holy Land. Now they had lost the island that had replaced it. The pattern was becoming uncomfortable. A charitable order became a military order. A land-holding order became a naval power. A power in the Crusader East became an island state. And now that island state was gone. How many times can an identity be uprooted before it becomes only a memory? The years after Rhodes were dangerous because defeat creates silence around an institution. Allies may praise your sacrifice while quietly wondering whether supporting you is still worth the cost. Rivals may smile politely while waiting for your privileges to be redistributed. Younger men may hesitate before joining a cause that seems to be retreating across the map. Even faith, when tested by repeated loss, has to pass through the very human corridor of doubt. The Hospitallers had to survive the battle after the battle, the struggle to remain necessary. They wandered without a permanent home, relying on the protection and calculations of greater rulers. Their future depended on negotiations among powers whose interests did not always match the order's dreams. This was not the age of simple crusading enthusiasm. European rulers had their own wars, rivalries, debts, and ambitions. A displaced order of knights could be admired, but admiration did not automatically produce a secure harbor. Here, the shadow of the Templars returns quietly. The Templars had been destroyed when they became politically vulnerable. The Hospitallers after Rhodes were not destroyed, but their vulnerability was plain. They needed a patron, but not a master who would absorb them. They needed land, but not land so comfortable that their military purpose would dissolve. They needed a frontier, because without danger they lost relevance. Yet the frontier that could save them might also consume them. This contradiction would define their next home. Rhodes was the first collapse because it taught the Hospitallers that even a powerful island fortress could be taken by an empire willing to pay the price. It also taught their enemies that the order was stubborn, mobile, and difficult to finish. The knights could lose their walls and still carry away their command structure, their rituals, their contacts, their reputation, and their grievance. Defeat became portable. There is something almost unsettling in that. Most powers are attached to territory. Take the city, seize the treasury, break the dynasty, and the power changes form or disappears. The Hospitallers were different. They were territorial, certainly, but not only territorial. Their true continuity lived in the order itself, in vows, hierarchy, memory, and a disciplined ability to begin again under worse conditions than before. When they left Rhodes, they carried with them the knowledge that Suleiman had beaten them once. They also carried the knowledge that he had not ended them. That distinction would matter decades later, when Ottoman sails again filled the horizon. Malta would not be a repeat of Rhodes, but every man who understood the order's past knew the comparison was waiting. Another island, another imperial assault, another test of whether endurance was enough. Rhodes had been lost with honor. Malta would have to be held, or the long history of adaptation might finally run out of places to go. After Rhodes, the Hospitallers needed a home badly enough that almost any island could begin to look like mercy. Almost. Malta was not the prize a romantic mind might imagine. It was not Rhodes reborn, with all the old prestige simply waiting to be restored. It was smaller, poorer, and more exposed. Its soil was thin. Its resources were limited. Its position was dangerous in the most practical sense. Close enough to North Africa to feel the reach of corsair power, close enough to Sicily to matter, and exposed enough that any great conflict in the central Mediterranean could turn its harbors into a target. When Emperor Charles V granted Malta to the Hospitallers in 1530, the arrangement solved one problem by creating several more. The order had land again. It had a base again. It had a political identity that could be anchored to a real place rather than carried around Europe like a wounded memory. But the gift came with a kind of hidden warning. Malta was not safe. Malta was a responsibility placed in the path of danger, and perhaps that was exactly why the Hospitallers could accept it. A comfortable estate somewhere deep inside Christian Europe might have kept them alive in a legal sense, but it would have hollowed out their purpose. The order did not merely need shelter. It needed a frontier. Its existence still depended on the argument that it served as a military religious shield against Ottoman and North African Muslim power in the Mediterranean. Without an enemy nearby, without risk, without the possibility of service, the Hospitallers might have survived as a decorated relic, respected, ceremonial, and quietly irrelevant. Malta prevented that. It was poor, yes, but it sat at a hinge of the sea. Look at the map, and the logic becomes sharper. The Mediterranean was not one flat arena. It was a series of passages, narrows, islands, coasts, and harbors. Control did not always mean ruling vast territory. Sometimes it meant holding a place where ships had to think twice. Malta stood between Sicily and the North African coast, near routes that connected the western and eastern Mediterranean. Its harbors, especially around the Grand Harbor, were far more valuable than its fields. The land might disappoint a farmer, but it could tempt a strategist. That contrast defines Malta's importance. From the shore, it could look hard, dry, and ungenerous. From the water, it offered something rare, a sheltered naval position in a contested sea. Ships could be repaired there. Raiding expeditions could depart from there. Intelligence could pass through there. A fleet based there could threaten movement between Ottoman-aligned North Africa and the wider Mediterranean world. Malta's weakness as a land economy became almost secondary beside its strength as a maritime instrument. Charles V understood enough of this to place the Hospitallers there, though the gift was not pure charity. Great rulers rarely give away strategic islands because they are feeling sentimental. The emperor gained a hardened military order on a vulnerable frontier, a force that could help guard the approaches to Sicily and resist Ottoman influence without requiring him to personally garrison every stone. The Hospitallers gained a base, but also inherited the burden of defending a position that larger powers found useful. This was not a rescue without strings. The knights were expected to hold a dangerous place because danger was their profession. That is the unsentimental core of the arrangement. Malta was a gift in the way a shield may be a gift to someone standing in the front rank. Useful, necessary, and heavy. The order's first impression of Malta was not one of easy gratitude. Later memory would wrap the island in the grandeur of the siege and the glory of Valletta. But in 1530, the future capital did not exist. The mighty fortress city that would come to symbolize Maltese endurance was still unbuilt. The knights arrived not to inherit an impregnable bastion, but to begin the long, expensive work of making the island defensible. And that work had to be done under the pressure of geography. Malta could not feed a large military population indefinitely without supply. Its people were already accustomed to vulnerability. The island lay in a world where raids were not abstract fears, but recurring possibilities. Captivity, ransom, and coastal violence belonged to the lived reality of the region. The Hospitallers were not moving into a blank fortress board. They were inserting themselves into an existing island society, with its own anxieties, habits, and relationship to the sea. This matters because the story of Malta is often told as if the island were simply a stage built for knights. It was not. There were Maltese communities there before the order arrived, and they would bear the cost of the island's new role. Fortifications may be planned by commanders, but sieges are endured by populations. When Malta became the Hospitallers' base, the island's strategic value increased, and with it the danger to everyone living under those walls. The order gained a home. The Maltese gained protectors, rulers, and a larger target painted across their horizon. History rarely gives clean bargains. For the Hospitallers, Malta's poverty may even have sharpened their discipline. There was little room for illusion. Rhodes had been a prestigious possession. Malta was a project. The order had to convert a hard, exposed island into a functioning military headquarters. It had to think like engineers, sailors, diplomats, tax collectors, and commanders all at once. The old crusading language remained, but it now had to be translated into harbors, walls, supply routes, cannon platforms, and negotiations with Sicily. The knights were not being restored to the past. They were being pushed into a new form. That is why Malta should not be understood merely as the place where the Great Siege happened. It was the answer to a crisis that began decades earlier. After losing Rhodes, the Hospitallers might have drifted into ceremonial survival. Instead, they accepted a poor island with excellent harbors and terrible strategic luck. In doing so, they made a choice that was both bold and bleak. They would remain relevant by standing where the next storm was likely to break. No one in 1530 could know the exact shape of that storm, but they could read the winds. The Ottoman Empire was expanding its reach. North African corsair power was deeply tied into the violence and politics of the sea. Christian and Muslim fleets watched each other through trade routes, raids, and reprisals. Malta lay in the middle of that argument, a limestone interruption in waters no empire could afford to ignore. The gift, then, was unwanted only if one expected safety. For an order built out of exile, Malta offered something harsher and more useful. It offered a purpose with walls around it, a harbor with consequences, and a future dangerous enough to keep the Hospitallers alive. A harbor can look peaceful when no fleet is coming. That is one of the illusions Malta offered. Blue water, pale stone, sharp sunlight, fishing boats moving where warships might one day anchor. But the Hospitallers did not have the luxury of seeing the island as scenery. To them, every inlet was a question. Every ridge was a possible gun position. Every narrow approach across the water suggested where an enemy might land, bombard, or force an entry. Malta had to be read like a threat. The order's task was not simply to occupy the island. It had to convert geography into defense. That meant studying the harbors, the channels, the promontories, the places where ships could shelter, and the places where cannon could command the water. In a Mediterranean increasingly shaped by artillery, courage alone was not enough. Stone had to be placed with calculation. Walls had to be thick enough to absorb punishment. Forts had to speak to one another across water, not in words, but in fields of fire. The island's most important feature was the Grand Harbor and the neighboring inlets around it. These waters could shelter fleets, support raids, and serve as the beating heart of a naval base. But what made them valuable also made them vulnerable. A harbor is a prize precisely because ships can enter it. The same channel that welcomes a friendly galley may guide an enemy toward your throat. So the Hospitallers began the long work of hardening the place. They strengthened existing positions and built new ones. They developed the fortified settlements around Birgu and Senglea, and paid particular attention to the exposed points that guarded the approaches to the harbor. Fort St. Angelo, already a dominant position at Birgu, became central to the island's defense. Fort St. Elmo, placed at the tip of the Sybaris Peninsula, would later prove both vital and terribly exposed. Its purpose was clear: command the entrance to the harbors and delay any enemy who wished to use them. Delay is an underrated form of power. People often imagine fortresses as places that either hold or fall, as if the only meaningful outcome is the final one. But in siege warfare, time itself can be the prize. A fort that cannot survive forever may still change the campaign if it consumes enough days, enough ammunition, enough men, enough confidence. A wall may be doomed and still be useful. A small position may matter not because it can defeat an empire, but because it can make the empire bleed before reaching the main gate. The Hospitallers understood this because their own history had taught them the price of time. Rhodes had not fallen in an afternoon. The Holy Land had not vanished in one clean stroke. Catastrophe often arrived through sequences: a lost outpost, a weakened supply line, a delayed ally, a breach that could not be repaired quickly enough. Malta had to be prepared against that slow logic. The Order's defenses were not only stone, they were administrative, maritime, and psychological. Grain had to be stored, weapons had to be maintained, powder had to be protected from damp and accident. Gunners needed positions. Ships required crews, repairs, and discipline. Messages to Sicily and other Christian powers had to remain possible. The local population had to be governed, taxed, protected, and, when necessary, drawn into the island's survival. A fortress is not merely a wall. It is a system under stress before the first cannon fires. This is where the Hospitallers' unusual identity mattered again. They were not a normal garrison hired for a season. They were an order built around obedience, hierarchy, ritual, and endurance. Their religious life did not make them immune to fear, hunger, rivalry, or exhaustion. No vow turns a man into iron, but it did create a structure in which command could be framed as duty, and duty could be pinged to feel larger than individual survival. That could be powerful inside a siege, where morale often breaks before masonry does. Still, we should be careful not to make the island sound stronger than it was. Malta, in the decades before the Great Siege, was not an invincible fortress waiting patiently for its heroic test. Its defenses improved, but they remained uneven. The Order had limited resources, and building fortifications was expensive. Every improvement revealed another weakness. Every new wall required men to hold it. Every cannon position required powder, shot, maintenance, and trained hands. The geography helped, but it also complicated everything. Malta was a defensive opportunity, not a guarantee. The expectation of an Ottoman attack hung over these preparations like weather. It was not paranoia. The Hospitallers had made themselves impossible to ignore. From Malta, their ships could harass Ottoman interests and Muslim shipping. Their presence threatened the connection between Ottoman power in the east and the corsair world of North Africa. Their island sat too close to vital waters, too close to Sicily, too close to the routes along which empire and commerce moved. Sooner or later, a serious Ottoman response was not merely possible. It was logical, and the knights knew what such a response might look like. They had seen imperial siegecraft before. They knew that Ottoman commanders could bring artillery, engineers, infantry, naval strength, and patience. They knew that a fortress under bombardment becomes a living thing under injury, constantly patched, braced, and reopened. They knew that once the siege began, every earlier compromise in construction and supply would reveal itself without mercy. This is why Malta's fortification was also an act of imagination. The Hospitallers had to picture an enemy before he arrived. They had to ask where he would land, which fort he would isolate, which harbor he would seek, which wall would suffer first, how long relief from Sicily might take, and whether Europe would treat Malta as a front line or a distant inconvenience. Defensive architecture is made from stone, but it begins as a series of fears made practical. There is something deeply human in that. A community builds walls because it admits it may be attacked. It stores grain because it admits help may be late. It trains men because it admits courage without discipline is not enough. The Hospitallers were not simply expressing confidence in Malta. They were confessing the island's danger in the only language soldiers can afford: preparation. By the early 1560s, the island had become a kind of challenge written in limestone. To Christian powers, Malta represented a forward position in a contested sea, a place whose survival helped shield Sicily and the western Mediterranean. To the Ottomans, it was a hostile base, a nest of raiders, and an obstacle that could not be left permanently behind them. To the Hospitallers, it was home, duty, and perhaps the last great test of their reason to exist. The walls were not silent. They announced that the order had learned from exile. They announced that Rhodes had not been forgotten. They announced that a poor island, once reluctantly accepted, had been turned into a military argument. But walls can only argue for so long. Eventually, someone answers them. The Mediterranean of the 16th century was not a blue border between civilizations. It was a road. And like many roads, it carried pilgrims, merchants, soldiers, diplomats, fugitives, spies, and thieves. It carried grain, wool, timber, spices, weapons, letters, rumors, and human beings in chains. The sea did not belong neatly to one faith or one empire. It was crossed, contested, negotiated, and raided by people who often understood its practical rules better than the grand ideologies used to describe it. Malta sat inside that moving world. To see the island only as a defensive shield is to miss half the story. The Hospitallers did not merely wait behind walls for the Ottoman Empire to arrive. From Malta, they took part in the violence of the sea. Their ships raided enemy commerce, pursued vessels, seized goods, and captured people who might be enslaved, exchanged, or ransomed. In their own language, this could be framed as holy war, defense, and service. In the experience of those taken at sea, it was something more immediate: loss, fear, and captivity. The same was true in reverse. North African corsairs, often operating within larger Ottoman-aligned networks, but not always reducible to simple imperial obedience, struck Christian shipping and coasts. Villages lived with the possibility of sails appearing at the wrong hour. Captives might vanish into markets, households, galleys, or ransom negotiations. Families might spend years trying to recover someone taken in a raid. Merchants calculated risk into every voyage. A sailor's faith mattered, but so did his cargo, his flag, his papers, and his luck. This is the sea that made Malta important. Not a clean chessboard, not a simple line between two worlds. A violent marketplace where religion, profit, revenge, state policy, and private ambition overlapped until they were difficult to separate. That overlap is essential. It prevents the story from becoming too tidy. The Hospitallers saw themselves as defenders of Christendom, and there is no need to pretend that identity was false. It shaped their rituals, their politics, their recruitment, and their sense of mission. But their mission also operated through practices that were harshly material. A captured ship meant money. Captives could mean ransom. Raiding weakened enemies, but it also sustained the raider. The moral language of crusade and the economic logic of maritime predation were not strangers. They often traveled in the same hull. For viewers used to modern navies and national borders, corsair warfare can feel almost lawless. In its own time, It had rules, licenses, patrons, courts, customs, and arguments over legitimacy. But those rules were uneven and often brutal. One side's lawful prize could be the other side's piracy. A captive's fate might depend less on abstract justice than on social status, market value, religious identity, and whether relatives or institutions could pay. This was the Mediterranean's shadow economy. Ransom letters, intermediaries, conversions, negotiations, and the human traffic that made ideology profitable. Malta benefited from this system while also suffering under its threat. That is the uncomfortable balance at the heart of the island's role. The order fortified Malta because it feared attack. It attracted attack because it became an active base of naval pressure. Its ships helped keep the Hospitallers relevant to Christian Europe, but the same activity made the island more intolerable to Ottoman strategists and North African corsair leaders. A quiet Malta might have been ignored longer. A Malta that struck outward invited a reckoning. This does not mean the Great Siege was caused by one raid, one insult, or one simple act of revenge. History rarely moves so cleanly, despite how tempting that makes a story. Ottoman motives were strategic, political, and symbolic. Malta threatened sea routes, sheltered an enemy order, and stood near Sicily, a major Christian possession. The island's capture could weaken Christian naval activity and strengthen Ottoman influence in the central Mediterranean. It would also remove an old adversary whose very survival after Rhodes was a lingering irritation. But Malta's aggression mattered because it gave the island a presence beyond its size. Small places become large when they interfere with movement. A narrow pass, a harbor, a fortified island. These can weigh more heavily than their acreage suggests. The Hospitallers understood this. They could not match the Ottoman Empire in territory, population, or wealth, but they could make a strategic nuisance of themselves. They could impose costs. They could force ships to consider Malta when planning routes. They could make the sea less predictable. In empire, nuisance is not a small thing. A nuisance that survives too long begins to look like defiance. Defiance, if left unanswered, may encourage others. And so the island became more than a naval base. It became a symbol of unfinished business. The violence of the Mediterranean also shaped the mental world of the men who would defend Malta. These were not soldiers raised in isolation from the enemy. They lived in a region of contact. Captives crossed religious lines. Merchants negotiated across them. Renegades changed sides. Languages mixed in ports and prisons. Information moved through sailors, slaves, traders, and defectors. Even hatred required a kind of intimacy. The opposing worlds knew each other through wounds, bargains, and repeated encounters. That intimacy made the conflict sharper, not softer. The Hospitallers knew what captivity could mean. Jean Parisot de Valette himself had experienced enslavement in his earlier life, according to well-established accounts of his career. That kind of experience did not produce gentle moderation. It could harden a commander's imagination. Defeat was not theoretical. It had a smell, a price, a routine. Men who had seen the inside of the galley system understood that losing Malta would not simply mean surrendering a flag. For the Maltese population, too, the sea was not abstract. It was livelihood and danger together. Boats brought trade, news, fish, and supplies. They also brought raiders. The horizon could feed you or destroy you. Living on such an island meant developing a particular alertness, a habit of reading distance. A sail was never just a sail until you knew whose sail it was. That atmosphere helps explain the siege before it begins. By 1565, Malta was already living in a state of expectation. The Ottoman fleet did not appear out of a peaceful void. It came into a world prepared by decades of raiding, retaliation, fortification, and fear. The island had made itself useful, dangerous, and hated. The order had survived exile by becoming a maritime power. But maritime power carried consequences. There is a temptation to tell this story as a miracle of defense alone. A small island holding against a mighty empire. That is true as far as it goes, but incomplete. Malta was not merely attacked because it was weak. It was attacked because it mattered. And it mattered because the Hospitallers had spent 35 years making sure it could not be ignored. So before the cannon opened, before Fort Saint, Elmo became a name written into siege memory. Before the walls of Birgu and Senglea were tested, the conflict had already been moving across the water for years. Every captured ship, every coastal raid, every ransom paid in grief and coin, every galley rowed by chained men, every prayer for safe passage had helped draw the lines tighter. The sea had been speaking for a long time. In 1565, the empire finally answered. Jean Parisot de Valette was not young when Malta's great test arrived. That fact is sometimes treated like a decorative detail, the kind of thing that makes a commander look more legendary in hindsight. The old warrior, stern and unbending, standing against the strength of an empire. But age, in de Valette's case, is more than atmosphere. It helps explain the kind of leadership he brought to the siege. He had lived long enough to be stripped of illusions. By 1565, de Valette had already passed through the hard curriculum of the Mediterranean frontier. He had fought, commanded, governed, and endured captivity. Accounts of his life place him among those who knew the brutal reality of galley slavery, not as a distant rumor, but as experience. That matters because the siege of Malta was not for him a symbolic contest viewed from a safe command chamber. He understood what defeat could mean for bodies, not just banners. A younger commander might have imagined rescue more easily. De Valette seems to have imagined consequences. This does not mean he was incapable of hope. A commander without hope is useless. But his hope had a severe quality, tied to preparation rather than comfort. He did not lead Malta as if courage alone would summon a miracle. He led as someone who believed discipline was the only bridge between fear and survival. The order had walls, cannon, ships, and vows, but under siege, these things mattered only if men obeyed while exhausted, hungry, wounded, and terrified. That was where de Valette's authority became central. The Knights Hospitaller were not a loose band of adventurers. They had hierarchy, ritual, and a culture of obedience. Yet no institution commands automatically in a crisis. Structures that look impressive in ceremony can crack under bombardment. Men who bow in peacetime may argue when the hospital is full, the powder is low, and the enemy has opened another breach. Leadership in such moments is not only about giving orders, it is about making surrender feel less imaginable than endurance. De Valette was very good at that. Not gentle, perhaps. Not warm in the way modern audiences often prefer their heroes to be. The surviving image of him is harder. Disciplined, proud, relentless, and at times unforgiving. But Malta did not need a comforting figure at its center. It needed a man who could make a frightened island behave like a single body. There is a danger, of course, in turning him into a statue. Great sieges often produce great man stories because they simplify chaos. One commander becomes the face of thousands of choices made by engineers, sailors, soldiers, civilians, priests, servants, messengers, and unknown defenders whose names rarely survive. De Valette mattered profoundly, but he did not hold Malta alone. He became the hinge around which a larger system moved. The order's discipline, the Maltese population's endurance, the fortifications, the supplies, the hope of relief from Sicily, and the mistakes and pressures inside the Ottoman command. Still, some figures shape events by narrowing the range of possible behavior. De Valette did that. His refusal to surrender was not merely personal stubbornness. It became a policy, then a moral climate. When a leader makes clear that collapse will not be accepted as ordinary, everyone beneath him must measure themselves against that severity. The effect can be inspiring. It can also be frightening. In a siege, those two emotions are often neighbors. He also understood the symbolic weight of Malta. If the island fell, the loss would not only remove a base, it would suggest that the Hospitallers' long chain of adaptation had finally broken. After Acre, after Rhodes, after decades of rebuilding, another defeat might reduce the order from a frontier power to a wandering relic. For De Valette, who had given his life to the order, that possibility must have been almost physically intolerable, and beyond the order lay the wider Mediterranean. Malta guarded more than itself. Its harbors threatened Ottoman movement and helped shield Sicily. Its fall could have opened the Central Sea to new pressure and given Ottoman prestige a dramatic victory. Whether every European ruler grasped the urgency in the same way is doubtful. Politics has always been gifted at arriving late. But de Valette had no need to exaggerate the danger. He only had to look at the map. He also had to look at his own men. Among the defenders were knights from various European backgrounds, soldiers, sailors, and Maltese inhabitants whose homes and families were bound to the outcome. Their reasons for fighting were not identical. Some defended faith, some honor, some livelihood, some because there was nowhere else to go. The commander's task was to bind these motives together tightly enough that they did not come apart under Ottoman pressure. That binding required more than speeches. It required visible conduct. De Valette could not ask others to endure danger while seeming to preserve himself too carefully. In siege memory, commanders are watched constantly, where they stand, when they appear, how they respond to bad news, whether they punish panic, whether they show fatigue. All of this becomes part of the defense. The walls have stones, morale has gestures. De Valette's greatest strength may have been his ability to turn the siege into a test of identity. For the knights, to surrender Malta was not simply to lose a position. It was to betray the meaning of their survival. For the Maltese, to yield meant trusting the mercy of a military system after months of resistance, a prospect no one could view lightly. For the wider Christian world, Malta's fall would be another sign that Ottoman power could reach deeper into the central Mediterranean. The stakes were layered, and De Valette seems to have understood each layer. This is why his old age becomes important again. An old commander does not necessarily fear death less, whatever legends claim, but he may fear a wasted life more. De Valette had seen the order survive too much to preside calmly over its final disgrace. He had seen captivity and knew what defeat could strip away. He had seen the sea's violence, the fragility of alliances, and the cost of underestimating an empire. His severity was not theatrical. It was historical memory turned into command. When the Ottoman fleet finally approached Malta, de Valette was not facing the unknown. He was facing a danger he had been preparing to recognize for decades. That may be why his resistance carried such force. He did not need to invent courage in the moment. He had built his life around the expectation that such a moment might come. The island would need walls, powder, food, and relief. But it would also need a will at the center strong enough to keep the pieces from separating. In 1565, Malta had that will. It came in the form of an old man who understood, perhaps better than anyone around him, that surrender could be more terrible than death, and that an order which had outlived exile, defeat, and political ruin might still vanish if its nerve failed at the wrong hour. In May of 1565, the waiting ended. For years, Malta had lived with the idea of an Ottoman attack as a future shape, a thing imagined in plans, fortifications, supply lists, and anxious conversations near the harbor. Then the future became visible. Sails appeared on the horizon. Not one ship, not a raiding party, a fleet. The Ottoman Armada came carrying the weight of empire. To the defenders watching from Malta, the sight must have been both terrifying and strangely clarifying. Fear often grows in the imagination because it has no edges. Once the enemy appears, fear becomes practical. Men can count ships, estimate landing sites, move guns, close gates, send messages, distribute powder, and pray with more urgency than elegance. The question is no longer whether the storm will come. The question is where it will strike first. The Ottoman force that arrived before Malta was not a mob drawn together by appetite alone. It was an imperial expedition, with commanders, soldiers, sailors, artillery, engineers, and the experience of a state that had taken fortified places before. The empire of Suleiman the Magnificent knew siege warfare. It knew how to move men and guns. It knew that walls could be solved by patience, pressure, and calculation. Against this stood Malta, fortified, yes, but poor, exposed, and held by a much smaller defending force. That imbalance is central to the drama, but it should not be misunderstood. Malta was not defenseless. The Hospitallers had spent decades strengthening the island. They understood the harbors. They had forts, cannon, discipline, and the leadership of de Valette. But preparation does not erase arithmetic. The attackers could absorb losses that would have been catastrophic for the defenders. They could choose where to apply pressure. They could bombard, probe, isolate, and attempt to break the island piece by piece. The defenders had fewer choices. They had to hold everything that mattered for long enough. This is the cruel geometry of a siege. Attackers may fail many times and still attack again. Defenders may succeed day after day and still be ruined by one breach, one exhausted position, one delayed relief force, one mistake made under smoke. Victory for the attacker can arrive suddenly after weeks of failure. Victory for the defender usually means continuing not to lose. Malta's survival would depend on that unattractive kind of success. The Ottoman commanders faced their own problems. Malta was not an empty rock waiting to be occupied. Its harbors and forts created a defensive puzzle. The geography around the Grand Harbor mattered deeply. Whoever controlled the approaches could influence where fleets sheltered, where artillery was placed, and how assaults unfolded. The attackers needed more than a landing. They needed to reduce the positions that made the harbor dangerous. This is why Fort St. Elmo became so important. Placed at the tip of the Skyberas Peninsula, St. Elmo guarded the entrance to the Grand Harbor and Marsamset Harbor. It was exposed, vulnerable, and not built to withstand an endless imperial fury. But it stood in exactly the wrong place for the Ottomans to ignore. Before the main strongholds of Birgu and Senglea could be dealt with properly, the fort had to be neutralized. A small fort became a lock on a much larger door, and locks in warfare are often smashed at great cost. For the defenders, the arrival of the Ottomans forced a grim recognition. Their fortifications had not been built to create comfort. They had been built to buy time. Time for relief from Sicily, time for Ottoman disease, heat, casualties, and command tensions to grow. Time for the attackers' confidence to thin. Time for Europe to realize that Malta was not a distant inconvenience, but a front line. But time has to be purchased with bodies. The first days of the siege carried the confusion common to all large military operations. Ships maneuvered, troops landed, commanders argued, assessed, and committed themselves to courses that would later be judged by men who did not have to stand beneath cannon fire. The Ottoman leadership had to decide how to take the island efficiently. The defenders had to decide how much to risk in each position, especially in a place like St. Elmo, where courage could delay the enemy but not guarantee survival. De Valette's problem was severe. If he abandoned exposed positions too quickly, the Ottomans would gain the harbors and tighten their grip. If he reinforced them too heavily, he might sacrifice men needed later at Birgu and Senglea. Every decision carried a shadow. In a siege, there are rarely clean options. There are only losses arranged in different orders. This is where the Great Siege becomes more than a contest of numbers. It becomes a contest of interpretation. Each side had to read the other correctly. The Ottomans had to judge how stubborn the defenders would be, how quickly relief might come, and whether Malta could be broken before the campaign season. Heat, disease, and exhaustion turned against them. The Hospitallers had to judge whether the Ottomans would commit fully to St. Elmo, whether the main assaults would follow quickly, and how to preserve morale when the enemy's strength seemed to multiply across the shoreline. The island itself seemed to shrink under observation. Places that had once been ordinary became charged with meaning. A landing beach, a ridge, a gun platform, a gate, a chapel, a storehouse. The civilian population, often pushed to the edge of military narratives, lived through the same narrowing of the world. The siege transformed daily life into logistics and fear. Food, water, shelter, rumor, and injury became part of the battlefield. Malta was not just defended by knights in armor. It was endured by people whose names seldom reached the center of the story. And above all of it stood the question no one could answer yet. Would help come in time? Relief from Sicily was possible. But possibility is not bread, powder, or men on the wall. European politics could be slow, cautious, and divided. The defenders knew that they might become famous too late. Many fortresses had been praised after they were lost. Many commanders had been admired after their men were dead. Malta needed more than admiration. It needed endurance long enough for admiration to turn into action. The Ottoman arrival also carried symbolic weight. This was not only a campaign against an island, it was a campaign against the order's stubborn refusal to disappear. The Hospitallers had survived Acre, survived the fall of Rhodes, survived homelessness, and rebuilt themselves on a rough island that empire now meant to crush. If Malta fell, the pattern of survival might finally end. The Ottoman victory would say that no stone refuge, however stubborn, could indefinitely resist the logic of imperial power. If Malta held, the meaning would be different. It would suggest that empire could be delayed, frustrated, even wounded by a smaller force that understood geography, discipline, and time. Not defeated in some final, world-ending sense. History is rarely so tidy, but checked, made to pay, forced to retreat from a place it had expected to master. In May 1565, none of that was certain. There was only the fleet, the island, the old commander, the frightened inhabitants, the waiting forts, and the first movements of a siege that would soon become one of the most punishing contests of the 16th century Mediterranean. The empire had arrived. Now Malta had to prove that arrival was not the same thing as conquest. Fort St. Elmo was never the largest stronghold on Malta. It was not the deep heart of the defense. It was not where the order placed its final hope. It stood exposed at the end of the Sybaris Peninsula, looking out over the entrances to the Grand Harbor and Marsamset Harbor, a stone point thrust into dangerous water. Its position made it valuable. Its position also made it vulnerable. That is often how military importance works. The places most worth holding are not always the places easiest to defend. For the Ottomans, St. Elmo had to be taken, as long as the fort remained in Christian hands. It complicated their use of the harbors and threatened their movements around the most important waters of the island. The Ottoman army could not simply ignore it and proceed comfortably to the main hospitaller positions at Birgu and Senglea. The fort was a small lock on the harbor system, and the empire had arrived with every intention of breaking it. For de Valette and the defenders, the calculation was more painful. St. Elmo could not hold forever. Its walls were exposed to concentrated artillery. Its garrison could be isolated. Reinforcing it meant sending men into a position many must have understood was close to doomed. Yet abandoning it too soon would give the Ottomans what they needed at the beginning of the campaign: control, momentum, and confidence. The fort's real purpose became not permanent survival, but delay. Delay sounds modest until one remembers what it can cost. The battle for St. Elmo became a contest over time, and time in a siege is never abstract. It is measured in shattered masonry, bodies carried from the walls, powder smoke in the lungs, surgeons working beyond exhaustion, and men trying to sleep while knowing the next bombardment may open the stones beneath them. The defenders inside the fort were not merely holding a position. They were spending themselves so that the rest of Malta might live longer. This is where the siege enters its harsher moral terrain. From a distance, commanders speak of sacrifice with clean language. They say a fort must be held. They say time must be bought. They say a position is essential. All of that may be true. But inside the walls, sacrifice has individual faces. It is a man ordered to stay when everyone can see the enemy guns are closing in. It is a wounded defender who knows evacuation may not come. It is the knowledge that your courage may be praised precisely because survival is unlikely. The defenders of St. Elmo did not simply die for symbolism. They forced the Ottoman command to commit heavily to a position that was expected, by many calculations, to fall more quickly. Days became weeks. The fort absorbed bombardment and assault with a stubbornness that altered the rhythm of the campaign. Every additional day at St. Elmo gave Birgu and Senglea more time to prepare. Every Ottoman casualty there weakened the force that would later turn against the main defenses. Every delay increased the pressure of heat, disease, fatigue, and uncertainty. A doomed fort can become a weapon if it dies slowly enough. That is the grim brilliance of St. Elmo's defense. It did not defeat the Ottoman army. It did not save itself. It did something less dramatic and more consequential. It damaged the attacker's timetable. In war, especially siege war, timetables matter. Armies are not machines that can simply continue forever because a commander wills it. They consume supplies. They suffer sickness. They lose experienced men. Their morale rises and falls with expectations. If a campaign begins with the assumption that one obstacle will fall quickly and that obstacle refuses, then the entire operation begins to feel heavier. The Ottomans eventually brought terrible force against the fort. Artillery battered the walls. Assaults pressed closer. The defenders repaired, resisted, and endured under conditions that must have narrowed life to the next order, the next breach, the next rush of attackers. The language of heroism can easily become too smooth here. It can polish away fear, but fear was surely present. Fear does not vanish because men are brave. It is the material bravery has to work with. This is part of what makes St. Elmo so compelling. Its defenders were not invulnerable figures in a legend. They were exhausted men in a failing position, bound by command, faith, discipline, pride, and the terrible knowledge that the rest of Malta was depending on their refusal to collapse too early. Their stand became meaningful precisely because it was not easy, and because the outcome was never a clean victory for them personally. De Valette's role in this episode has often been remembered with severity. He needed the fort held, and he demanded endurance from those inside it. There were moments, according to accounts of the siege, when the defenders' suffering and the question of relief or withdrawal became intensely fraught. We should be cautious with the exact emotional texture of these episodes, because later siege narratives often sharpen dialogue and gesture into moral theater. But the broader truth is clear enough. Command required him to ask men for more than safety could justify. That is the burden of defensive leadership. If de Valette had treated every endangered garrison as too precious to lose, Malta might have fallen faster. If he treated men only as expendable pieces, morale might have curdled into resentment or despair. He had to hold the line between necessity and cruelty, and siege conditions make that line almost impossible to see clearly. St. Elmo shows us the cost of his strategy more honestly than any triumphant monument can. The Ottoman side paid heavily too. The attackers were not faceless numbers. They included soldiers ordered forward against broken walls, men caught in the open under fire, commanders trying to maintain pressure while casualties mounted. Among the Ottoman forces, the struggle for St. Elmo became a test of prestige and persistence. Once so much had been committed, pulling back or changing course became politically and psychologically difficult. The fort that was supposed to unlock the harbor became a trap of commitment. This is another overlooked truth of siege warfare. Attackers can become prisoners of their own plan. The longer St. Elmo held, the more necessary its capture seemed. The more necessary it seemed, the more men and energy had to be poured into taking it. What began as a preliminary operation became a consuming fight. The defenders could not win in the ordinary sense, but they could make the Ottoman victory arrive damaged. And they did. When St. Elmo finally fell in June 1565, the fort was ruined and its defense essentially annihilated. The Ottomans had taken it, but the price had been severe. They had lost time, men, and momentum. They had learned that Malta would not be Rhodes repeated in a predictable rhythm. They had also awakened, among the remaining defenders, a fierce and terrible clarity. The siege had crossed a threshold. It would not be a negotiation with cannon in the background. It would be endurance against annihilation. The fall of St. Elmo was therefore both defeat and turning point. To the Ottomans, it opened the way toward the main harbor defenses. To the Hospitallers, it proved that even exposed positions could bleed the empire. To the Maltese and the defenders at Birgu and Senglea, it offered a brutal lesson. The enemy could be delayed, but not gently. The island would survive only by paying in pieces. There is no need to romanticize that. The sacrifice of St. Elmo was not beautiful. It was useful, tragic, and decisive in the way siege decisions often are. Morally uncomfortable, militarily necessary, and remembered afterward in language that can never quite carry the weight of those who stood there. The fort fell, but it fell slowly enough to change the siege. When Fort St. Elmo fell, the siege changed its temperature. Until then, the struggle had been brutal, but it still carried the shape of military calculation. Guns were placed, walls were battered, assaults were made and resisted. Men died in large numbers, but the violence had a grim structure to it, the logic of an army reducing a position and a garrison refusing to yield. After the fort was taken, something darker moved across the harbor. The defenders of St. Elmo had bought time with their lives, and the Ottomans had paid dearly to take a ruined place. That combination, exhaustion, anger, humiliation, and relief, is dangerous in any siege. A fortress that resists longer than expected often becomes more than an objective. It becomes an insult. By the time attackers enter, the men inside are no longer simply enemies. They are the reason friends are dead, commanders are furious, and the campaign has already begun to drift from its intended rhythm. The fall of St. Elmo was followed by acts of terror meant to speak across the water. Accounts describe the bodies of dead defenders being mutilated and sent toward the remaining Christian positions. De Valette, in turn, is said to have answered with executions of Ottoman prisoners, their bodies used as a message fired back toward the enemy. The exact details come to us through siege narratives shaped by memory, propaganda, and the needs of later retelling, so we should handle them carefully. But the larger point is not doubtful. Both sides understood psychological violence as part of the battle. This was not only cruelty without purpose, it was communication. In siege warfare, messages do not always arrive as letters. They arrive as smoke, flags, severed negotiations, displayed bodies, sudden silence from a fort that had been firing the day before. Terror was used to shrink the imagination of the enemy. It told the defenders, "This is what awaits you." It told the attackers, "Do not expect mercy." It hardened choices that might otherwise have remained open. After St. Elmo, surrender became more difficult to imagine. That mattered profoundly. A siege often turns on the minds of those trapped inside the walls. If defenders believe that capitulation may preserve their lives, they may eventually pressure commanders to negotiate. If they believe surrender will only deliver them to humiliation, slavery, torture, or death, then resistance can become the less terrifying option. De Valette understood this. So did the Ottomans. Fear was not a side effect of the siege. It was a weapon both sides tried to aim. Yet fear is difficult to control once released. It can stiffen resistance, but it can also poison judgment. It can make commanders ruthless when flexibility might have helped. It can make soldiers fight with extraordinary courage or collapse into panic. It can transform a strategic contest into a feud of honor, where every loss demands an answer, and every answer deepens the wound. Malta after Saint. Elmo moved closer to that condition. The harbor itself became a theater of warning. Across the water, the remaining defenders at Birgu and Senglea could see what had happened to the fort that had protected them. Saint. Elmo had been a physical barrier. Now it became a memory of what delay cost. The men in the main positions knew that the Ottoman army had taken the first gate of the island's defense. They also knew that the price had been high enough to prove the enemy could be hurt. That double knowledge is psychologically strange. It gives hope and dread at the same time. The defenders could say, "The Empire bleeds." They could also say, "The Empire still comes." Both statements were true. St. Elmo had shown that Ottoman victory was not effortless, but it had not stopped the siege. The guns would turn. The pressure would shift. The main strongholds, where more soldiers and civilians waited, were now about to receive the force that had broken the fort. For the Ottomans, the capture of St. Elmo should have been a moment of progress. And in a military sense, it was. The fort no longer blocked them. They had taken a key position. But victories can carry bad news inside them. If a small, exposed fort had taken so much effort, what would happen at the stronger positions? How much time had been lost? How many experienced men were gone? How much heat, sickness, and frustration had entered the army while the campaign stood fixed on a single point? This is where the sacrifice of St. Elmo continued working after the walls fell. Its defenders were dead, but the delay they created remained alive inside the Ottoman camp. It lived in the calendar. It lived in casualty lists. It lived in the fatigue of men who still had the hardest fighting ahead of them. It lived in doubts that may not have been spoken openly, because armies are not fond of admitting that a victory has frightened them. The Hospitallers also had to absorb the loss. Their own men had been consumed in the defense. Some of the bravest and most committed had vanished into the ruined fort. That absence mattered. Heroic memory can make sacrifice feel clean, as if the dead are immediately converted into morale. Real communities do not work so neatly. Grief and pride arrive together, and not everyone receives them in the same proportion. Some men would have felt inspired. Others would have felt the cold arithmetic. If St. Elmo cost that much, what will the next assault cost? De Valette's task was to make grief usable. He had to turn horror into resolve without allowing it to become despair. That required a careful kind of severity. Too much mourning could weaken the walls. Too little could make men feel that their comrades had been spent like powder. The defenders needed to believe that St. Elmo had not been wasted. They needed to understand its loss as part of a larger defense, not the first step in inevitable collapse. This is one reason stories of the fort became so powerful. Human beings need meaning when suffering exceeds ordinary language. A garrison wiped out in a ruined position can be remembered as a disaster or as a sacrifice that saved time for others. The second memory is not necessarily false. In Malta's case, it carried real military truth, but it also served an emotional purpose. It told the living that endurance had a shape. It told them that death inside the walls could still act upon the future. The siege now entered a more intimate phase of violence. The Ottomans had passed the outer threshold. The remaining defenses were crowded with wounded men, anxious civilians, exhausted commanders, and soldiers who had watched the fate of St. Elmo from across the water. There was no longer any room for the comforting idea that the enemy might test the island and leave. The campaign had become too costly for easy withdrawal and too bitter for easy mercy. The island had been forced into a narrower moral world. There would be fewer illusions now. The defenders knew what the empire could do. The Ottomans knew what Malta was willing to spend. Both sides had learned enough to hate the next phase before it began. That is the real terror after the walls fell. Not only the violence done to the dead, not only the reprisals, not only the messages sent across the harbor in forms no humane mind can admire. The deeper terror was the realization that St. Elmo had not ended anything. It had revealed the terms under which the rest of the siege would be fought. No quick collapse, no gentle surrender, no victory without a bill. The empire had taken the fort. Malta had lost it. But from that ruin came a new and harder fact. The island was no longer merely defending stone. It was defending its will against a war designed to break it. After St. Elmo, the siege turned inward. The Ottomans had taken the exposed fort at the mouth of the harbors, but the heart of Malta's defense still remained across the Grand Harbor, in the fortified strongholds of Birgu and Senglea. These were not distant abstractions on a commander's map. They were crowded places of stone, timber, powder, prayer, fear, and human breath. Behind their walls stood knights, soldiers, sailors, Maltese civilians, servants, wounded men, and everyone whose fate had become tied to the survival of the island. The war now came for them directly. Birgu, with Fort Saint Angelo rising at its end, had become the order's principal seat. Senglea, on the neighboring peninsula, formed another essential part of the harbor defense. Together, they made the Grand Harbor a trap as well as a refuge. Any attacker who wished to break Malta had to deal with these positions not as symbols, but as practical obstacles, bristling with guns, and defended by men who had already seen what happened when a fort was overwhelmed. The Ottoman army shifted its fury toward these remaining walls. Artillery began its patient work. Cannon fire is often imagined as a series of dramatic explosions, but in a long siege its true power is repetition. One shot breaks a surface, another widens the wound, a third loosens what the defenders repaired in darkness. Day after day, stone becomes dust, and dust becomes a slope an attacker may climb. The sound itself becomes part of the siege, not a single thunderclap, but a rhythm that enters the nerves. For the defenders, every breach was an argument with time. Repair crews worked under danger. Earth, timber, rubble, barrels, and whatever else could be found were turned into emergency defenses. A wall in this period was not simply built once and trusted. It had to be remade while being destroyed. Engineers and ordinary laborers became as important as men with swords. The difference between survival and collapse might be a hastily raised barricade behind a shattered section of masonry. This is one of the details that changes how we should picture the siege. The defense of Malta was not a painting of knights standing nobly along perfect battlements. It was dirty, improvised, technical, and exhausting. Men fired cannon, dragged stones, carried water, moved the wounded, patched defenses, loaded muskets, and waited for assaults that might come by land or water. The age of chivalric memory had collided with the age of gunpowder, and the Hospitallers had to live inside both worlds at once. The Ottomans did not rely only on bombardment. They probed the harbor defenses with amphibious attacks, seeking weak points where boats, troops, and timing might achieve what cannon alone could not. The Grand Harbor became not simply a body of water, but a battlefield of movement. Boats crossed under fire. Men tried to land where defenders could be overwhelmed. Guns answered from walls and forts. Smoke drifted across the water, confusing distance and direction. In such moments, the geography of Malta became intensely intimate. A channel, a shoreline, a narrow approach could decide whether men lived or drowned. Senglea, in particular, faced terrible pressure. Its position made it valuable, and value drew violence. Attacks by water tested the defenders' ability to respond quickly, to shift men and firepower, to prevent the enemy from turning a landing into a foothold. A successful breach at Senglea could have unhinged the harbor defense and placed Birgu under even greater danger. The defenders understood that they were not holding isolated walls. They were holding a system. If one part gave way, the rest would feel the pull. That is the discipline of a fortress under combined assault. Every position must think of the others. Birgu depends on Senglea. Senglea depends on Birgu. Both depend on Saint Angelo, on supply, on command, on messengers, on the ability to interpret the next Ottoman move before it becomes irreversible. The defenders did not have the comfort of responding to one kind of danger. The enemy came with artillery, infantry, boats, siege works, and psychological pressure all at once. And yet the Ottoman commanders faced their own narrowing options. They had already spent heavily at St. Elmo. Now the main defenses were proving stubborn, and every failed assault increased the cost of continuing. This is not to suggest that the Ottomans were near defeat at every moment. That would make the story too easy. They remained powerful, dangerous, and capable of breaking Malta if the right weakness appeared. But the campaign had become less clean than planned. The island was consuming the army's strength in increments. The defenders could feel the walls shaking. The attackers could feel the season moving. This tension gives the fighting around Birgu and Senglea its particular force. Both sides were under pressure from different clocks. Malta had to survive until relief arrived, if relief arrived at all. The Ottomans had to force a decision before disease, weather, casualties, fatigue, and uncertainty drained the campaign beyond usefulness. The walls were the visible battlefield. Time was the invisible one. Inside Birgu and Senglea, courage was not constant flame. It came and went in human pulses. A man might be brave in the morning and near collapse by night. A civilian might endure bombardment with astonishing calm, then break at the sight of a wounded relative. A commander might speak firmly while privately wondering whether the next assault would be the one that finished everything. Morale is often described as if it were a single number rising or falling. In reality, it is a crowd of private battles, held together by habit, authority, belief, and the fear of what happens if everyone admits the same doubt at once. De Valette had to keep that crowd from becoming a panic. His leadership now moved through orders, appearances, punishments, encouragements, and the symbolic power of being seen. The old Grand Master's refusal to yield had already become part of the island's inner weather. But even a strong commander cannot simply command walls to hold. He needed men who believed that obedience still had meaning, even after Saint Elmo. He needed civilians to endure what they had not chosen. He needed the idea of relief to remain alive without letting it become an excuse for passivity. The assaults tested that balance again and again. At close quarters, siege warfare lost any remaining elegance. Men fought at breaches, in ditches, near barricades, across broken masonry slick with dust and blood. The weapons of the period were loud, heavy, slow, and intimate in turn. Cannon at distance, arquebuses and muskets closer in, pikes, swords, stones, fire, and whatever could be used when formal order dissolved. The PG-13 version is still harsh enough. Bodies crushed by rubble, lungs burned by smoke, ears stunned by blast, hands shaking as they tried to reload. War at the wall was not theatrical. It was labor under terror. The Maltese population must be kept in view here. The siege was not endured only by the knights whose names fill Chronicles. Local inhabitants carried supplies, worked on defenses, sheltered under bombardment, suffered hunger and injury, and watched their island become the focus of imperial violence. Their role is sometimes reduced to background, but no fortress survives long if the people inside it are treated as scenery. Malta held because many forms of endurance overlapped. The Ottomans, too, were not a single faceless force. Their soldiers endured heat, counterfire, disease, and the frustration of fighting an enemy who would not collapse according to expectation. Some were veterans, some were far from home. Some followed orders into assaults that must have seemed nearly impossible once the defenders concentrated fire on the approaches. A serious history does not require sympathy to recognize humanity. The attackers suffered because command demanded that they keep trying. The battle for Birgu and Senglea became a furnace for both sides. And in that furnace, the meaning of Malta changed again. At first, the island had been a strategic objective. Then St. Elmo had become a test of delay. Now the main strongholds became proof of whether the Ottoman army could translate power into possession. Empire had arrived with ships, guns, and numbers, but possession required crossing water, climbing broken stone, surviving counterattack, and forcing men who believed surrender meant ruin to stop resisting. That last step proved the hardest. Again and again, the walls seemed close to breaking. Again and again, the defense bent around the damage. There is no need to pretend this was inevitable. Malta could have fallen. A single successful assault, a failure of coordination, a collapse of morale, a late relief force or a commander's mistake might have changed everything. The fascination of the siege lies partly in how narrow survival became. The island did not hold because it was untouchable. It held because, at each crisis, enough people did what was necessary before the next crisis arrived. That is not the clean shape of legend. It is something more impressive. By the time fire had passed over Birgu and Senglea for days and weeks, the siege had become a contest in exhaustion. The Ottomans still had strength, but they no longer had the advantage of surprise or easy confidence. The defenders still had walls, but many were broken, patched, or barely trusted. Both sides could see the cost. Neither side could yet see the end. Across the harbor, St. Elmo lay ruined, its sacrifice already absorbed into the logic of survival. Now Birgu and Senglea had to do what St. Elmo could not. They had to remain standing. There comes a point in a siege when the enemy is no longer only outside the walls. It is inside the body. Hunger enters first as inconvenience, then as arithmetic. Wounds that might once have been treated with patience become urgent because there are too many of them. Disease moves quietly through crowded spaces, helped by heat, exhaustion, fear, and the simple fact that human beings were never meant to live for weeks under bombardment. Sleep breaks into fragments. Rumor travels faster than official orders. Every sound from the harbor asks the same question. Is relief coming? Or is that only another hope inventing a sail? Malta, by this stage, was not merely resisting an Ottoman army. It was resisting collapse from within. This is the part of the story that grand paintings often fail to capture. A siege is remembered through assaults, flags, breaches, and commanders, because those are visible. But much of survival depends on less dramatic forms of endurance: carrying water, rationing grain, tending the wounded, moving ammunition, repairing the same wall yet again, calming a terrified child, and choosing not to repeat a rumor that might spread panic through an already strained town. The island had become a machine of necessity. Every person inside the defenses was drawn into its motion. Knights and soldiers held the walls, but behind them others worked to keep those walls meaningful. The Maltese population suffered not as witnesses to history, but as participants trapped inside it. Homes, churches, storehouses, hospitals, and shelters all became part of the same defensive organism. The siege reduced ordinary life to its essential functions: food, water, shelter, care, obedience, prayer, and waiting. Waiting may sound passive. It was not. Waiting under siege is an action repeated every hour. It means not opening the gate, not giving in to despair, not allowing one bad report to become a general collapse, not letting the wounded believe they have been abandoned, not letting the able-bodied think their labor no longer matters. The defenders of Malta had to wait actively, with tools in their hands and danger above their heads. Discipline made that possible, but discipline alone was not enough. The Hospitallers possessed a structure built for obedience. Their vows and hierarchy gave them a language for suffering that could be turned into duty. For the knights, endurance could be framed as faithfulness, as honor, as the continuation of a long struggle that had begun far from Malta and passed through Acre, Rhodes, and exile. That kind of story can steady men when practical hope is thin. But stories do not fill stomachs. They do not close wounds by themselves. They do not stop infection. So the defense required a constant marriage between belief and logistics. Faith gave meaning to endurance. Administration gave endurance something to stand on. Powder had to be counted. Food had to be distributed. Repairs had to be prioritized. Men had to be shifted where the pressure was greatest. Civilians had to be managed with enough firmness to prevent chaos and enough care to preserve cooperation. This is where de Valette's leadership again becomes important, though not in a simple heroic way. His refusal to surrender was the central spine of the defense, but a spine is useful only if the rest of the body continues to function. He had to maintain authority across exhaustion. He had to insist that Malta was not beaten while everyone could see how badly it was being hurt. He had to make the hope of relief from Sicily feel possible without making survival depend entirely on it. The island could wait for help, but it could not behave as if help had already arrived. That balance is difficult. Too much confidence becomes delusion. Too much honesty becomes poison. A commander in such circumstances must speak in a language that is neither comforting nor despairing. He must make people believe that the next hour matters, even when the full outcome remains unknowable. The defenders' morale rested on several fragile pillars. One was memory. Saint Elmo had fallen, but not quickly. Its sacrifice could be interpreted as proof that Ottoman power could be slowed. Birgu and Senglea had endured assaults that might have broken weaker defenses. Each survival, however costly, added to the belief that the island had not yet reached its final limit. Another pillar was fear. That sounds strange, but fear can bind as well as weaken. After the violence that followed St. Elmo, many defenders had reason to believe surrender would not guarantee safety. The possibility of captivity, reprisals, or worse made continued resistance seem not only honorable, but practical. When the alternatives narrow enough, courage may become the most rational choice left. A third pillar was faith, though we should avoid imagining it as simple serenity. Religious belief under siege could bring comfort, but it could also intensify the stakes. If the defense was understood as sacred duty, then failure carried spiritual weight as well as military consequence. Prayers, processions, and vows did not remove fear. They organized it. They gave frightened people gestures to perform when events had moved beyond their control. And then there was the stubbornness of place. By now, Malta was no longer merely a base granted by Charles V or a strategic position in the central Mediterranean. It had become the ground beneath the defenders' suffering. The more the island was damaged, the more its survival mattered. This is one of the paradoxes of siege warfare. Destruction can deepen attachment. A wall repaired 3 times under fire becomes more than masonry. A street crossed under bombardment becomes part of the map of endurance. A harbor watched day after day becomes an emotional horizon. The Ottomans, meanwhile, had their own internal pressures. They too suffered from heat, disease, casualties, fatigue, and the frustration of a campaign that had stretched far beyond an easy demonstration of power. Their army remained dangerous, but danger does not mean invulnerability. Men in the Ottoman camp also waited for orders, for progress, for signs that the next assault would succeed, for the campaign to justify what had already been spent. The longer Malta held, the more the siege became a burden on the attackers' morale as well as the defenders. This is a crucial point. Malta did not need to destroy the Ottoman army outright. It needed to outlast the army's willingness and ability to continue under worsening conditions. That is a different kind of victory, less satisfying to the imagination, but often more realistic. Endurance can be offensive when it forces the stronger side to keep paying for every step. The island's defenders were not winning in the way an army wins a field battle. They were winning by remaining unresolved. Every day that Malta did not fall changed the meaning of the Ottoman expedition. What began as a campaign to remove a troublesome base became an increasingly costly struggle against a place that refused to behave according to its size. The island was too small to defeat the empire in any grand sense, but large enough to embarrass it. And embarrassment in imperial warfare can become dangerous. Still, inside the walls, such strategic interpretations may have offered limited comfort. The wounded did not suffer less because historians would later admire the delay. Hungry civilians did not endure more easily because Malta's position mattered on a map. The defenders lived inside the immediate experience of pain, uncertainty, and fatigue. Their achievement was not that they felt no despair. It was that despair did not become government. That may be the most human way to understand Malta's survival. Not as a miracle floating above ordinary weakness, but as a community and a military order repeatedly preventing weakness from becoming collapse. A siege does not require everyone to be brave at once. It requires enough people, at enough moments, to continue. Someone repairs the breach. Someone carries the message. Someone obeys the order. Someone tells a frightened neighbor that the wall still holds. Someone looks toward Sicily again, sees nothing, and returns to work anyway. This is how islands survive before relief appears, not in a single blaze of glory, but in thousands of small refusals. By late summer, the siege had pressed Malta close to its limits. The defenders were battered. The Ottoman army was strained. The sea remained the only road by which salvation could come, and also the road by which destruction had arrived. Every horizon mattered now. Every delay mattered. Every rumor of help could lift the island for a moment, then drop it harder when nothing appeared. Malta held its breath because breath was almost all it had left, and still the walls did not open. Relief did not arrive like a clean ending. It came late, uncertainly, and into a siege that had already consumed far more than anyone watching from a safe distance could easily understand. By the time forces from Sicily finally reached Malta in September 1565, the island had been reduced to a state of endurance so severe that even hope must have felt dangerous. Hope, after all, can wound people when it arrives too soon. For months, Malta had looked outward. Every rumor from the sea had mattered. Every report of ships gathering in Sicily had been weighed against the fear that politics, caution, bad weather, or simple delay would leave the island to its fate. Relief was never merely a military possibility. It was a psychological necessity, something the defenders needed to believe in without depending on too completely. If they surrendered their will to the idea of rescue, and rescue failed, the walls might fail inside their minds before they failed under cannon. But now help had come close enough to become real. The Sicilian relief force was not an enormous army sweeping everything aside in one grand cinematic charge. That is not how Malta was saved. The more honest version is less tidy and more revealing. The Ottoman army had already been weakened by months of hard fighting, casualties, disease, heat, frustration, and the stubborn refusal of the island to collapse. The arrival of relief mattered because it struck an army that had been made vulnerable by endurance. Malta was not rescued from strength alone. It was rescued after it had helped exhaust the hand trying to crush it. That distinction matters. It prevents the ending from becoming too simple. If we imagine the relief force as the sole cause of victory, we miss the meaning of Saint Elmo, Birgu, Senglea, the civilians, the repairs, the hunger, and the daily refusal to yield. But if we imagine the defenders could have held indefinitely without outside help, we replace history with flattery. Malta survived because resistance and relief finally met at the right moment. The Ottoman commanders now faced the calculation every besieging army dreads: continue and risk being caught between the battered defenses and new forces from outside. Withdraw and accept that the campaign had failed to achieve its purpose after terrible expense. Neither choice was honorable in a simple way. Armies do not enjoy admitting that a smaller place has outlasted them. Empires especially dislike such admissions, because imperial power depends not only on force, but on the expectation that force will eventually be enough. On Malta, that expectation had been damaged. The Ottomans had taken St. Elmo. They had battered the island's defenses. They had brought the Hospitallers and the Maltese population close to catastrophe. but they had not taken the core of the island before relief arrived. And in siege warfare, almost can be a cruel word. Almost through the wall, almost in control of the harbor, almost at the point where the defenders break, almost victorious. Then the season turns. Then reinforcements appear. Then an army that has spent too long trying to finish the work must ask whether another assault will win the island or merely deepen the loss. The retreat, when it came, was not the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. That should be said clearly. Malta did not end Ottoman power in the Mediterranean. Suleiman's empire remained formidable, and the struggle between Ottoman and Christian forces at sea continued. History rarely gives one battle the authority to close an age by itself. The Great Siege was not a final verdict on empire, but it was a check. A public, costly, unforgettable check. For the Hospitallers, survival was its own victory. They had not conquered new territory. They had not destroyed the enemy fleet. They had done something more basic and, in context, more extraordinary. They had remained. The order that had lost the Holy Land and Rhodes had faced the empire again and had not been uprooted. That fact alone altered its reputation. Europe did not need Malta to be a perfect victory in order to celebrate it. It needed a story in which Ottoman advance had been resisted, and Malta gave it one. Celebration, however, can be a dangerous lens. From a distance, people could turn the siege into a triumph of faith and courage. Those elements were real, but they were not the whole truth. The men and women on Malta had survived terror, hunger, injury, disease, bombardment, and uncertainty. They had watched friends vanish into ruined forts and patched walls that seemed destined to break again. Their victory did not feel like a parade when it first arrived. It must have felt like shock, exhaustion, grief, and only slowly relief. Imagine the silence after the guns. Not pure silence, of course. There would have been cries, orders, groans from the wounded, movement in the ruined streets, the creak of ships, the work of burial, the search for missing people, the inventory of what was left. But compared with months of bombardment, even damaged sound can feel like silence. A siege teaches the body to expect impact. When impact stops, the mind may not immediately understand that it is allowed to unclench. The defenders had survived, but survival opened its own ledger. How many dead? How many wounded? How many homes destroyed? How much powder gone? How much food consumed? How many walls shattered? How many families altered beyond repair? Victory is often announced in a single sentence. Its aftermath is counted slowly by people who have to live inside the sentence. De Valette emerged from the siege as a figure of European renown, but even that fame rested on a landscape of ruin. His refusal to surrender had become legendary because the island had held. Had Malta fallen, the same severity might have been judged differently. History is not always fair to commanders. It tends to moralize outcomes. Persistence that succeeds becomes greatness. Persistence that fails may be called fanaticism, pride, or miscalculation. In de Valette's case, the outcome protected the reputation. Yet the deeper lesson of the relief and retreat belongs not only to him. Malta survived because the Ottoman army was made to spend too much time and strength before outside help arrived. The island did not win by overpowering an empire. It won by denying the empire a quick decision. It transformed Ottoman advantages into burdens. More men to feed, more casualties to absorb, more heat and sickness to endure. more prestige invested in a campaign that would not resolve. This is endurance as strategy, not passive suffering, not romantic martyrdom, a deliberate refusal to become easy. The relief force from Sicily gave the final pressure needed to turn endurance into survival. Without it, Malta's position might have become impossible. With it, the Ottomans had to reconsider the price of continuing. The retreat that followed was therefore not a miracle detached from military reality. It was the result of accumulated strain. The delay at St. Elmo, the defense of Birgu and Senglea, the internal resilience of the island, and the arrival of outside aid at the moment when the attackers were no longer fresh enough to ignore it. And when the Ottoman forces withdrew, Malta remained behind them, broken, smoking, wounded, but unconquered. That image mattered across Europe. A small island had endured what many believed should have destroyed it. A displaced order of knights had survived another imperial test. The central Mediterranean had not been opened in the way the Ottomans intended. The Hospitallers, far from disappearing into the footnotes after Rhodes, had become the center of one of the century's most celebrated defenses. But the island itself could not live forever on celebration. Its ruins asked a practical question. If Malta had survived once, how would it survive the next time? When the Ottoman army withdrew, Malta did not look like a place chosen by destiny. It looked wounded. The walls had been battered. Fortifications were scarred, broken, hurriedly repaired, and broken again. Streets had carried the weight of fear for months. The dead had to be counted, buried, remembered, and in many cases, never properly known. The living had to do something even harder than endure a siege. They had to return to life in the place where endurance had nearly killed them. Europe celebrated. That was understandable. Malta offered a story many Christian rulers and chroniclers wanted badly. A small island, a religious military order, and a population under terrible pressure had resisted the Ottoman Empire and survived. The victory could be preached, painted, written, and used. It became proof that Ottoman power, however formidable, was not inevitable. It became a symbol of courage, faith, and defensive resolve. But symbols are lighter than ruins. On the island itself, survival demanded construction. The siege had revealed not only Malta's strength, but its vulnerabilities. The exposed Siberias Peninsula, where Fort St. Elmo had suffered so terribly, could not remain simply a lesson written in rubble. If Malta was going to remain the order's home and a central fortress of the Mediterranean, memory had to become architecture. So the Hospitallers built. The city that rose after the siege, Valletta, was not merely a commemoration of Jean Parisot de Valette, though his name became fixed to it. It was an answer to artillery, an answer to Ottoman ambition, an answer to the terrifying knowledge that Malta had survived once, but might be tested again. Its streets and bastions expressed a colder form of remembrance than any poem, the belief that gratitude was not enough. The dead would be honored by making the island harder to kill. That is the real meaning of Valletta. It was memory made practical. The Hospitallers had learned, across centuries, that survival did not belong to the purest or the most nostalgic. The Templars became legends after political destruction. The Hospitallers became something stranger and more durable, an order that repeatedly changed its form without admitting that its mission had ended. Hospital attendants became crusading warriors. Warriors became island rulers. Exiles became naval powers. Defeated defenders of Rhodes became the builders of Malta. They survived because they adapted, not beautifully, not innocently, not without violence, ambition, or contradiction. Their ships raided as well as defended. Their faith existed alongside ransom, slavery, and maritime warfare. Their heroism at Malta does not erase the harsher world they inhabited, but history rarely offers clean instruments. The Hospitallers endured because they understood how to turn loss into structure. Acre was lost, so they moved. Rhodes was lost, so they moved again. Malta nearly fell, so they built deeper into the stone. The Great Siege did not end the conflict between empires, faiths, and sea powers in the Mediterranean. It did not bring peace to the waters between Europe and North Africa. It did not transform the knights into saints, or the Ottomans into villains from a simple tale. What it did was reveal the power of endurance when joined to geography, discipline, leadership, and time. The island that should have fallen did not survive by miracle alone. It survived because Fort St. Elmo died slowly, because Birgu and Senglea held under fire, because civilians endured the machinery of siege, because de Valette made surrender feel impossible, because relief arrived before exhaustion became final, because the Ottoman army, for all its strength, was forced to pay too much for every step. And afterward, the survivors refused to treat survival as the end of the story. They built Valletta as if the siege were still speaking. That may be the clearest answer to the question we began with. How did a displaced order of knights survive an empire's assault? Not by remaining trapped in the past, not by being stronger than the empire, not by escaping fear. They survived by becoming harder to finish. Stone by stone, harbor by harbor, defeat by defeat, the Hospitallers learned the discipline of remaining. And on Malta, in 1565, that discipline held just long enough for history to turn around them. The island should have fallen. Instead, it became a fortress with a memory.